Here's something that surprised me. For most of human history, governments didn't try to ban the world's oldest profession. They tried to tax it. They registered the workers, zoned the buildings, appointed officials to run the books, and treated the whole thing as a public utility that happened to involve sex. The story you've been told, that it was always a shameful secret hidden in dark alleys, gets the past almost completely backwards. From Athens to Edo, Japan, the brothel was often a licensed, taxed, government-aware institution. So let's actually walk through how these places worked, civilization by civilization, and bust a few famous myths along the way. The Babylon lie. We have to start in Babylon, because this is where the biggest myth in the whole subject was born. You've probably heard that ancient Babylonians ran sacred prostitution, where every woman had to go to the temple of the love goddess, sit there, and sleep with a stranger for money that was given to the gods. This comes from the Greek historian Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BC. He claimed every Babylonian woman, once in her life, had to sit in the precinct of the goddess and couldn't go home until a stranger tossed a coin in her lap. He called it the foulest of all their customs. Here's the problem. It's almost certainly not true. The scholar Stephanie Boudin wrote an entire book in 2008 called The Myth of Sacred Prostitution in Antiquity, and her conclusion is brutal. This institution probably never existed anywhere in the ancient Near East. Herodotus, who never visited Babylon and didn't speak the language, was basically writing tabloid material about the weird foreigners to make Greeks feel superior. The Babylonians had a word for an ordinary, secular sex worker, harimtu, and they had a completely separate class of cloistered temple priestesses called nadatu, who were usually celibate, owned property, and lent money out at interest. People kept smashing those two groups together and inventing holy prostitutes who never existed. So the most famous fact about ancient brothels is mostly Greek gossip. Good start. That doesn't mean Babylon had no sex trade at all. It absolutely did, and the law actually engaged with it. The Code of Hammurabi, carved around 1754 BC, is one of the oldest legal documents on earth, and it bothers to regulate the taverns where a lot of this activity happened. Those taverns were typically run by women, and the code sets rules for honest pricing, and even makes a tavern keeper responsible for reporting criminals who gathered in her bar. There's a famous, harsh law stating that if one of those celibate priestesses so much as enters a tavern for a drink, she can be burned. The Babylonians clearly knew exactly what went on in these places. They just kept the holy women and the working women in strictly separate boxes, which is the precise distinction Herodotus blew right past. The harimtu even shows up in the oldest surviving great work of literature, the Epic of Gilgamesh, where a woman named Shamhat is the one who tames the wild man Enkidu and brings him into civilization. Her profession is treated as a normal, even civilizing part of the world. Solon's big idea. Speaking of the Greeks, they love to take credit for inventing things, including the regulated brothel. The story goes that the great Athenian lawgiver Solon, around 594 BC, set up the first state-run brothels in Athens, stocked them with enslaved workers, kept the prices low so even poor men could afford them, and used the profits to build a temple to Aphrodite. It's a great story. It might also be exaggerated. The detail doesn't come from Solon's own time. It mostly survives through a comic playwright named Philemon, who praised Solon for democratizing sex roughly 300 years after Solon was dead. That's the equivalent of trusting a modern comedy sketch as your only source for what happened in the 1700s. Historians think later Athenians simply projected their own system back onto their favorite founding father. What we do know for certain is that Athens taxed the trade. There was a real, documented levy called the pornikon telos, a prostitution tax, collected by contractors who bid for the right to gather it. The Greeks also had a strict social ladder. At the bottom were the pornei, enslaved women working out of brothels in the Kerameikos district near the city gates. In the middle were the flute girls, hired to entertain at men's drinking parties. And at the top sat the heterai, educated companions prized for their wit and conversation as much as anything else. The companion class. These heterai deserve their own moment, because they were not simply high-priced workers. They were some of the only women in Athens allowed to be clever in public. Take Aspasia, the partner of Pericles, the most powerful man in Athens. She was so respected for her intelligence that Socrates supposedly came to listen to her talk, though her enemies smeared her as a brothel keeper to attack Pericles through her. Or take Phryne, a model so beautiful she posed for the most famous sculptors of the age. When she was put on trial for a crime against the gods, legend says her lawyer won the case by tearing open her robe in court, so the jury could see her beauty and decide the gods must love her too. Lovely story. It only shows up in sources written centuries later, so most historians file it under myth. And then there's Neaera, an enslaved woman whose entire life became the subject of a surviving courtroom speech, our single best window into how this whole world actually operated. What made the heterai genuinely different was that men paid for their company over time, not by the act. A hetera might attend the symposium, the male drinking party where philosophy and politics got hashed out, and hold her own in the argument. She could own property, manage her own money, and in some cases became wealthy and famous in a society that otherwise kept respectable women indoors and silent. It's an uncomfortable irony, but for a certain kind of ambitious Greek woman, this was one of the only doors to independence the culture left unlocked. The trade-off was a total loss of respectability, and for the enslaved women at the bottom, of course, there was no independence at all, just ownership. Quick myth to kill, because it's all over the internet. You've heard that Greek prostitutes wore sandals that stamped the words, "Follow me," into the dirt, as an ancient form of advertising. There is no such sandal. Nobody has ever dug one up. It's a charming invention that historians keep trying to bury, and the internet keeps reviving. 2 coins in Pompeii. Now to Rome, where we have something the Greeks didn't leave us, an actual brothel you can still walk through. When Mount Vesuvius buried Pompeii in 79 AD, it preserved the lupanar, the most famous brothel in the ancient world. The name itself tells you how Romans thought. A prostitute was a lupa, a she-wolf, and a brothel was a lupanar, a wolf den. The building is small and grim. 5 tiny rooms downstairs with stone beds, faded erotic paintings over the doorways, and the walls covered in more than 120 pieces of graffiti. People wrote their reviews, their boasts, and their complaints right on the plaster, and we can still read them. The prices are the part that stuck with me. Much of the graffiti records charges of around 2 asses. To put that in perspective, 2 asses was roughly the price of a loaf of bread, and a cup of cheap wine cost about 1. At the bottom end of the market, this was snack money. The Romans were extremely organized about it too. Sex workers had to register with the aediles, the same officials who managed markets and public order, and they went onto an official list. We know the register was real because a noble woman named Vistilia once registered as a prostitute specifically to dodge Rome's adultery laws, which caused a public scandal in the year 19 AD. The token myth. While we're in Rome, let's stamp out another popular fake fact. You may have seen those little bronze Roman coins with a sex scene on one side and a number on the other, sold online and in documentaries as ancient brothel tokens. The story is that you'd buy one, hand it over, and the number told the worker which service you'd paid for. It's almost certainly wrong. These objects, called spintriae, were given that name by a scholar in 1559, not by the Romans. Modern researchers mostly think they were gaming pieces for a board game, or tokens for the public baths, since matching scenes with numbers show up, painted on the walls of the bathhouse changing rooms in Pompeii. The honest answer is that nobody actually knows what they were for. What we can say is that the cool brothel token story is a guess from a couple of centuries ago that got way too comfortable. Rome did tax the trade directly, by the way. The Emperor Caligula, always looking for cash, slapped a tax on prostitutes equal to the price of a single act per day, and it became a permanent revenue stream collected across the empire. It was so entrenched that the tax was sometimes still demanded from women who had long since left the profession, which gives you a sense of how the Roman treasury operated. There's even a grim joke buried in the language. The Romans called a brothel a wolf den, and their own founding legend says the twin founders of the city, Romulus and Remus, were raised by a she-wolf. Roman writers noticed the pun and ran with it, suggesting the famous wolf might have been a woman of the trade. The city that conquered the world may have named its origin story after a brothel worker, and the Romans thought that was hilarious. India's sex bureaucrat. If Rome was organized, ancient India was on another level entirely. There is a Mauryan text from around the 3rd century BC called the Arthashastra, a manual on how to run a state, attributed to the royal advisor Kautilya, and it contains the single most astonishing fact in this entire story. The state employed an official whose actual job title translates to Superintendent of Prostitutes. Let that sink in. This was a government department. The superintendent licensed and salaried the high courtesans, called gonikas, paying the top ones a generous state stipend. The state taxed their income, regulated their property, and even laid out rules for what happened when a courtesan grew old or fell ill, because she was treated as a long-term state asset worth protecting. And here's the genuinely wild part. These women were also used as spies. They entertained foreign visitors and government officials, then reported back on what those men said when they thought nobody important was listening. Rome registered sex workers. India turned them into a salaried intelligence network. The Indian courtesan was expected to be a cultured professional, trained in music, poetry, and the arts. The famous Kama Sutra, written a few centuries later, devotes a whole section to her, less about romance and more about how she should choose clients, manage her money, and know when to walk away from a bad arrangement. She was closer to a businesswoman than anything else, and the bureaucracy went deeper than just collecting a cut. The Arthashastra lays out a full human resources policy. A new recruit received a state allowance. There were fines for clients who cheated a courtesan, fines for courtesans who cheated clients, and rules covering injury, insult, and theft. If a man kept a courtesan from working, he owed the state the income she would have earned, because her lost wages were the treasury's lost wages too. The text even specifies that a courtesan had to name a successor or hand over a portion of her property to the crown. This is a government that thought about the sex trade the way a modern finance ministry thinks about a regulated industry, with schedules, penalties, and succession planning. For something written more than 2,000 years ago, it's almost eerily corporate. The Devadasi tangle. India also gives us a system that has been badly distorted, and it's worth getting right. The Devadasis were girls dedicated to temples, ceremonially married to a god, who performed sacred dances and rituals. They often held land and enjoyed real social status. For a long time, Western writers flatly labeled them temple prostitutes, and you'll still see that everywhere. It's a distortion, largely a product of British colonial moralizing in the 1800s. Colonial officials lumped together temple dancers, courtesans, and ordinary entertainers under one disapproving label and launched campaigns to stamp out what they called a vice. The real system was religious and economic, varied wildly from region to region, and only became degraded later, partly because of the very reformers who claimed to be saving these women. So the accurate version is a temple tradition the British recast as something it largely wasn't. China's talented women move east to China, and you find a culture that drew a razor-sharp line between two things Westerners tend to blur. On one side, ordinary commercial brothels. On the other, the elite courtesan, a cultural superstar trained in poetry, music, calligraphy, and conversation, who served the educated officials and scholars of the empire. During the Tang dynasty, the Great Pleasure Quarter sat in the capital, conveniently right next to the district where men took the imperial examinations. Stressed exam candidates and high officials mingled with courtesans who were sometimes accomplished poets in their own right, with verses that still survive in the Chinese literary canon. The state ran the system through registered music households, a hereditary class whose women supplied official entertainment. That institution lasted over 1,000 years and wasn't formally abolished until an emperor finally ended it in 1723. The most legendary district was the Qinhuai riverfront in Nanjing, home to a celebrated group of late Ming courtesans, remembered as cultural icons. But the same era had a much darker side. The so-called thin horses of Yangzhou, poor girls bought young and trained, specifically to be sold as concubines and courtesans. The phrase came from the idea of fattening up and grooming a cheap animal for resale at a profit, which tells you exactly how the buyers thought about it. The glamour and the cruelty sat side by side, which is true of almost every chapter in this story. What's striking about China is how thoroughly the elite courtesan was woven into the culture of the ruling class. A scholar official wasn't just buying company, he was buying an evening of music, witty poetry exchanges, and the kind of refined conversation his own wife was never educated to provide. Some of these women became famous artists whose work outlived the men who paid for it. A few even crossed into history, like the courtesan whose love affair with a general supposedly helped tip the fall of a dynasty. The line between entertainer, artist, and sex worker was blurry on purpose, and the most successful women learned to live in all three roles at once. The walls of Yoshiwara. Japan took the idea of zoning sex work and made it literal. In 1617, the Tokugawa government licensed a single-walled district to contain the entire trade in the city of Edo, the place we now call Tokyo. It was named Yoshiwara. After a great fire, it was rebuilt as a walled, moated compound with controlled gates, almost a small city of pleasure, deliberately designed so the authorities could watch exactly who went in and who came out. At the very top of its hierarchy were the Oiran, elite courtesans, who commanded staggering fees and lived by elaborate ritual. The grandest sight in Old Edo was the Oiran procession, a top courtesan walking with painful slowness through the streets on towering wooden clogs, trailing attendants, on her way to meet a client at a tea house. Now, the most important correction in this whole video. Geisha were not prostitutes. I'll say it again for the people in the back. Geisha were entertainers, artists trained in music, dance, and conversation, and they emerged later than the courtesans. In fact, the authorities specifically regulated geisha to keep them out of the sex trade, so they wouldn't compete with the licensed courtesans. Mixing the two up is the single most common mistake Westerners make about Japan, and now you won't be one of them. There was a brutal economy under all that silk, though. The women of Yoshiwara were overwhelmingly sold into the district as children by desperately poor families, then trapped by debts that only grew over time. A girl arrived owing the price her family had been paid, and then she was charged for her clothing, her food, her training, and her elaborate costumes, so the debt climbed faster than she could ever pay it down. Leaving was nearly impossible unless a wealthy client bought out the entire balance. They were, in practice, unfree. The whole glittering district ran on a quiet system of indentured servitude dressed up in beautiful kimono. The Japanese government finally passed an emancipation edict in 1872, partly under pressure from a strange international incident involving a Peruvian ship and accusations of slavery. The edict released the women from those debts, at least on paper. In reality, the trade quietly reorganized and carried on, because the poverty that fed it hadn't gone anywhere. That's a pattern you'll notice again and again. Governments could regulate the brothel, tax it, even abolish it on parchment, but none of them ever solved the desperation underneath it. The bishop's geese. Medieval Europe is where the church versus vice story gets interesting, because the answer was usually a shrug and an invoice. Far from banning brothels, many medieval cities owned and licensed them as ordinary municipal businesses, a source of revenue and a tool for keeping public order. The best example is in London, on the south bank of the Thames in Southwark, just outside the city's legal control. There, the brothels, known as the stews, operated under license from none other than the Bishop of Winchester, whose land this was. The church was directly profiting. The women who worked there got the grim nickname Winchester geese, and to be bitten by a Winchester goose was slang for catching a disease. A whole code of rules governed the houses, covering who could work, when they could open, and how they were treated. The medieval church tolerated all this on a simple, cynical logic that a little controlled vice protected respectable society from something worse. The idea often gets boiled down to a famous line about how, if you remove the sewer, you fill the palace with filth. That exact wording is actually a later medieval paraphrase, often wrongly pinned on St. Augustine or Thomas Aquinas. But the underlying sentiment really was Augustine's. He genuinely wrote that if you remove prostitutes from society, you'll throw everything into chaos through unchecked lust. The church held its nose and cashed the rent. Across the channel, it was even more organized. In southern France and parts of what's now Germany and Italy, town councils ran municipal brothels as a normal civic amenity, no different in principle from running the public baths or the marketplace. Some town records show the brothel listed in the municipal accounts right alongside the bridge tolls and the salt tax. There was also a strange honesty to the medieval setup. The women were required to wear identifying marks, a particular colored hood or a stripe on the sleeve, so they could be told apart from respectable wives in the street. It was demeaning, but it was also a kind of official recognition, a public admission that these women existed and had a place, however low, in the order of things. By the way, one popular tale claims a queen of Naples personally founded and chartered the brothel of Avignon in the 1300s. It's a great story that gets repeated constantly, and it appears to be completely made up. The regulated brothels of that region were real. The royal charter is a later fabrication. Aztec flower women. Let's cross the ocean to the Aztecs, because their world had a version of this too. Our main source is the Florentine Codex, a massive encyclopedia of Aztec life, compiled by a Spanish friar in the 16th century. In it, we meet the Ahui Anime, which translates roughly to the pleasure women. The friar's account is conflicted, which makes it interesting. He describes these women with a mix of admiration and disapproval, as skilled, beautifully adorned figures connected to the goddess of flowers and love, yet also as symbols of temptation. They stood out in Aztec society. While respectable women wore their hair bound up, the Ahui Anime wore theirs loose, used perfume and face paint, and chewed a kind of gum. They played a public role at major festivals, dancing alongside young warriors in the great ceremonies. Just remember that everything we know comes filtered through a Spanish priest with his own very strong opinions about all of it. The pox changes everything. So how did the great age of the licensed, taxed, government-run brothel come to an end, at least in Europe? Two things killed it, and they hit at almost the same time. The first was disease. In the 1490s, a terrifying new illness, syphilis, swept across Europe, first exploding around a war near Naples. Suddenly, the tolerated brothel wasn't just a moral question, it was a public health catastrophe, a place where a deadly, disfiguring illness spread fast. Cities that had happily collected brothel rent for centuries started slamming the doors shut. The second was religion. The Protestant Reformation in the 1500s swept away the old medieval logic of vice as a necessary evil and replaced it with a much harsher moral line. The two forces together were fatal. In England, King Henry VIII issued a proclamation in 1546 that closed the Southwark stews for good, ending centuries of the bishop collecting his rent from the geese. Same story everywhere. Step back and look at the whole sweep of it, and a pattern jumps out. Babylon, Athens, Rome, Mauryan India, Imperial China, Edo Japan, medieval London. Wildly different cultures, thousands of years and miles apart, almost none of them connected, and they nearly all landed on the same answer. Don't ban it, because that never works. Contain it, license it, register the workers, zone the buildings, and absolutely, positively tax it. The Empress Theodora of Byzantium reportedly came from this world herself, a performer of low birth who rose to rule alongside the Emperor Justinian, though the juiciest stories about her past come from a writer who openly hated her, so take them with a boulder of salt. Once in power, she funded a refuge for women trying to leave the trade. Even the people running these systems knew there was a human cost underneath the tax revenue. That's the part history usually leaves out. Behind every register, every licensed house, every clever government department were real people, most of them poor, many of them enslaved, navigating a world that found them useful and disposable in equal measure. The bureaucracy was remarkably sophisticated. The humanity was an afterthought, and the next time someone tells you the past was a simpler, more innocent time, you can tell them about the Marian civil servant whose official job was running the kingdom's courtesans, and watch their face do something interesting.